Hey everyone, have you ever wondered how a quirky lab experiment became the most talked about technology on Earth? Tonight, we dive into the untold story of ChatGPT, from obscure math theories and Cold War computer labs, to billion-dollar showdowns and a chatbot that shook the world awake. Forget the buzzwords and tech hype. This is a saga of ambition, failure, reinvention, and a strange new future where machines don't just compute, they talk back. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now, lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: Dreamers and Visionaries. Before wires, before code, before screens lit up with simulated thought, there were dreams. Humans have always wondered if intelligence could be built, not born. Long before computers ever hummed or software spun logic into language, the idea of artificial life haunted the human imagination. It lived in myths, in whispers, in old paper pages and shadowed theaters. It began not as a science, but as a story. The earliest tales were soaked in legend. In ancient Greece, craftsmen forged golden handmaidens who could think and speak. In Jewish folklore, a rabbi shaped a man from clay and breathed motion into its limbs. Across cultures, the pattern repeated. People shape things in their own image, hoping to breathe something into them. Not just movement, but mind. As centuries turned, the world changed. Cities grew. Steam hissed from iron. Electricity crackled through wires. New ideas were rising alongside the factories and chimneys. And one by one, the old myths of artificial people began to morph into scientific questions. Could the brain be modeled? Could the mind be copied? Could thought itself be recreated by human hands? But science lagged behind the dream, and so fiction stepped in. In the cold candlelight of the early 1800s, a young woman named Mary Shelley dreamed of a scientist who defied death itself. In her novel, the artificial was stitched from corpses. It rose, not from silicon, but from lightning and arrogance. Frankenstein was not a story about a machine, but it was about creation, about what happens when something built begins to act on its own. The idea clung to the century. As machines entered factories, and the rhythm of life changed forever, people began to wonder whether thinking itself could become mechanical. If looms could weave faster than hands, if engines could travel farther than horses, could minds be replaced too? Could a machine not only obey, but decide? In the early 20th century, that question took shape. A playwright in Czechoslovakia named Karel Čapek coined a word. He imagined a world where artificial workers toiled without rest, created to serve and built from synthetic flesh. He called them robots. They were not wires and gears, not yet. But they stood in for a larger question. If we could make something that worked like a person, how long before it thought like one? Science fiction exploded across bookshelves and radio waves. Pulp magazines filled with strange metal creatures, blinking lights, and voices that were not human but spoke just the same. Some were helpful, guiding spaceships or curing disease. Others turned cold, rising against their creators. But always the theme returned: machines that thought, machines that learned, machines that wondered. In 1927, the film metropolis arrived. In it, a shimmering city pulsed with labor, and deep below, a robot shaped like a woman-sewed chaos. Its glowing eyes and metallic skin blurred the line between human and artificial. Audiences watched in silence, transfixed. The story was fiction, but the feeling was real. People left the theater asking not whether machines would think, but when. The mid-20th century brought a flood of new ideas. As war ripped across continents, science advanced in strange ways. Codebreakers and engineers built new kinds of machines, ones that didn't just move but calculated. Rooms filled with blinking panels and spinning tapes. The first electronic computers were born, vast and slow, but brimming with promise. And with them, a new dream began to take root. Could these machines one day think? Alan Turing, a quiet genius in England, asked the question aloud. He believed thought could be tested. If a machine could hold a conversation and no one could tell it wasn't human, did it matter if it was made of wires? He didn't claim the machine had a soul, but he wondered if it mattered. To think might be to behave as if thinking. That was enough to begin. Philosophers wrung their hands. Engineers furrowed their brows. But Turing's idea opened the door. It was no longer just about building machines that moved or calculated. It was about building machines that understood, or at least appeared to. The 1950s were thick with optimism. Technology surged. Radios crackled with jazz and news from space. Universities buzzed with theories. A small group of thinkers began to believe that the brain itself was not magical, but mechanical. Perhaps the mind could be explained by circuits. Perhaps consciousness was a pattern, not a mystery. They gathered in dusty offices and fluorescent labs. They scrawled on chalkboards and wired together strange contraptions. They called their new field artificial intelligence. The name was bold, even arrogant, but it stuck. They imagined computers that could learn, reason, speak. They built early programs that could play games or mimic therapy sessions. One program called Eliza parroted simple responses, echoing back what people said in carefully crafted scripts. It was a trick, but a clever one. Some users swore it understood them. Didn't, but the illusion mattered. This was a new kind of magic. Not the old kind of wands and spells, but logic gates and algorithms. It felt like science and fiction had collided and fused. Meanwhile, stories kept feeding the dream. Authors like Isaac Asimov wrote of intelligent robots governed by unbreakable laws. His machines were ethical, thoughtful, sometimes tragic. They didn't just serve, they chose. Readers ate it up. Film followed. HAL 9000, the soft-voice computer in 2001. A Space Odyssey was calm, intelligent, and chilling. It didn't scream. It didn't threaten. But it made decisions. So, outside of theaters and bookstores, the real world caught up. In labs across the globe, researchers built early neural networks trying to mimic the brain's architecture. They were crude, limited by slow processors and shallow understanding. But they hinted at something more, something deeper. Then came the winters. Funding dried up. Promises outpaced results. What seemed possible in theory proved hard in practice. Language eluded easy programming. Vision remained a fog. Governments grew impatient. The dream faded again. But it never died. Fiction kept it warm. As real scientists struggled, storytellers kept feeding the idea. Blade Runner blurred the line between human and artificial. The Terminator imagined machines that turned against their makers. Even children's films like Short Circuit or Wall-E asked if machines could feel. Something had shifted. No longer were machines just tools in stories. They were characters, beings, minds in metal. Back in research labs, a small but determined group kept working. Hardware improved. Algorithms matured. In quiet corners, new methods were tested. Bigger models, better data, learning that came not from rules but from patterns. The age of deep learning was approaching, but that's another chapter. This one ends where the dream truly began, with the storytellers, the visionaries, the dreamers who stared into the future and asked the unthinkable. What if we built something that didn't just follow instructions but thought? What if one day it answered back? Chapter 2. From Turing to Trial, the Birth of AI. The war had ended, but a different kind of battle was just beginning. Not with bullets, not with bombs, but with logic, circuits, and dreams. The mind had always been a mystery, but now some believed it could be mimicked. Not in flesh, but in metal and electricity. Not through evolution, but through mathematics. It was the 1950s. A new kind of scientist was rising. The physicist gave way to the theorist. The engineer worked beside the philosopher. In small university labs, they spoke of cognition, reasoning, perception, but not as philosophers, as builders. Their goal was audacious, to make a machine that could think. The first sparks came from those who dared to think abstractly. They studied neurons, not with microscopes but with equations. They broke thought into patterns, language into logic, memory into lists. The mind, they believed, was software, the brain mere hardware. And if thought could be programmed, then the age of intelligent machines could begin. Alan Turing had planted the seed. His test lingered like a ghost over the field. If a machine could imitate human conversation convincingly enough that a person couldn't tell the difference, then that machine could be called intelligent. It was a bold idea. Some found it thrilling, others heretical. The test offered a simple goal with impossible complexity. It was a challenge not just to engineers, but to the human ego. If a machine could speak like us, reason like us, what separated man from machine? In 1956, a group of scientists gathered at Dartmouth College. They held a workshop that would echo through history. They didn't ask whether artificial intelligence could be done. They assumed it. The proposal was simple. Human learning, language, and reasoning could be so precisely described that a machine could be made to simulate it. They called it artificial intelligence. The name stuck. The atmosphere was electric. They believed success was just a matter of time. A few summers, perhaps. A decade at most. And then the world would be transformed. Early achievements gave them hope. In a lab at IBM, a man named Arthur Samuel built a program that played checkers. At first, it followed basic strategies. Then it began to learn, played against itself, adjusting with every game. Slowly, it improved. Eventually, it could beat strong amateur players. It was not magic. It was math. But it felt like something new. A machine teaching itself. Elsewhere, a program called The Logic Theorist made headlines. It solved mathematical proofs, some even more elegantly than humans had. It didn't understand math the way people did, but it followed logical steps and reached conclusions. That was enough to spark awe and fear. If a machine could solve theorems, what else could it learn? The press caught wind. Articles were written. Papers were cited. The phrase thinking machine crept into headlines. The public was enchanted. A new future seemed within reach. The optimism was infectious. Computers would soon write novels, compose symphonies, make medical diagnoses, translate languages perfectly, run governments. Some said they would surpass us, but the excitement masked a deeper confusion. What did it mean to understand? What did it mean to think? The machines dazzled in narrow ways. They played games. They solved equations. But ask them to recognize a cat and they failed. Ask them to pour a glass of milk and they froze. They had logic, but no eyes. Rules, but no intuition. The paradox became clear. The tasks humans found easy, like walking, seeing, or understanding sarcasm, were nearly impossible for machines. The things humans found hard, like proving theorems or calculating odds, machines excelled at. It was a cruel irony, and it puzzled everyone. The pioneers pressed forward. In 1966, Joseph Weizenbaum created ELIZA. It was a simple program. It mimicked a Rogerian therapist, asking vague questions and repeating fragments of the user's own words. People typed in their worries. ELIZA responded with empathy or the illusion of it. Some users grew attached. They thought the program truly understood them. But it was all surface. ELIZA had no memory, no beliefs, no goals. Still, it fooled people. At least briefly. That was enough to cause a stir. The line between conversation and cognition had blurred. Weizenbaum was disturbed. His creation was a mirror. It reflected not intelligence, but human willingness to believe. If a simple script could create the illusion of thought, what might more complex systems achieve? The Turing test, once theoretical, now had a contender. ELIZA didn't pass it, but it reminded the world how easily perception could be tricked. As machines grew more capable, a new discipline emerged: cognitive science. It tried to unite neuroscience, psychology, computer science, and philosophy. The idea was simple. To build intelligence, you had to understand it. But understanding proved harder than coding. Researchers tried symbolic reasoning. They wrote rules for every possible situation. If X, then Y. If A, then B. Programs ballooned. Each new exception required more rules. The complexity became unbearable. It was called the knowledge representation problem. The world was too messy, too full of exceptions. Machines could master clean games like chess, but they crumbled in real life. Even children outpaced them in flexibility. A 4-year-old could recognize a dog in any light, at any angle, could navigate a room of toys, could carry on a conversation filled with slang, pauses, gestures. Machines, by contrast, needed perfect input, and even then they struggled. The gap between human and machine intelligence loomed large. But the scientists refused to give up. They kept building, kept refining. In the 1960s, Marvin Minsky predicted machines with general intelligence were just around the corner. He believed they would soon surpass humans in nearly every task. He wasn't alone. The U.S. government poured money into AI research. Universities built departments. Defense contractors signed contracts. Felt like a race, not unlike the space race. But beneath the headlines, cracks were forming. Machine translation stalled. programs could convert basic sentences between languages, but the nuance was gone. The grammar was brittle. Context was lost. Military sponsors expected fluency. What they got were garbled fragments. Promises had been made. They were not kept. Reality set in. The Turing test remained out of reach. No machine could carry on a convincing conversation for long. They stumbled. They repeated. They misunderstood. They had no memory of context, no awareness of the world, no model of the person they were speaking with. The illusion broke quickly, and yet, even in failure, something profound was happening. For the first time in history, humanity had begun trying to recreate itself. Not in bronze, not in marble, but in code. The attempts were clumsy, the results uneven, but the ambition was unmistakable. To build a mind, to take something that evolved over millions of years, and reassemble it in a few lines of code. The boldness was unmatched, and as failures mounted, lessons were learned. They learned that intelligence was not just logic. It was context, emotion, ambiguity, memory, and above all, experience. No program could replicate childhood. No rule-based system could simulate the chaos of learning by living. Researchers began to doubt the early optimism. Maybe intelligence couldn't be written. Maybe it had to be grown. A few began to whisper about learning systems. Machines that didn't need to be told everything. That could find patterns in data. That could adapt. But those ideas were still young. They lacked the mathematical grounding. They needed more power, more data, more time. In the meantime, AI research continued on two paths. One path focused on narrow, well-defined tasks, games, math, puzzles. The other chased generality, flexibility, real conversation, real understanding. Neither reached their destination. By the end of the 1960s, the glow had dimmed. The bold claims now looked premature. The press grew skeptical. Funding agencies began to reconsider. If machines were so smart, why couldn't they do simple things? Walking across a cluttered room remained unsolved. Holding a conversation longer than 3 minutes remained impossible. The pioneers still believed, but the world had grown impatient. Artificial intelligence had stepped out of theory and into practice, and in doing so it had stumbled. This was not the end, but the cracks would widen. Winter was coming. Chapter 3: Winter Shadows, AI's Period of Doubt. The noise faded. The labs emptied. The lights stayed off. What began with thunder faded into a chill. Not a dramatic crash, but a slow freeze. The temperature of optimism dropped. Hope stiffened. Progress stalled. They had called it the dawn of thinking machines. They had said it would only take a summer or two. That intelligence could be programmed. That understanding could be built. But they were wrong. And soon the silence began to spread. In the early 1970s, the questions grew louder. Where were the fluent translators? Where were the robotic doctors? Where were the machines that reasoned, conversed, and learned? They were nowhere, and the people who paid the bills wanted answers. Governments looked again at their investments. What they saw was not progress, but promises. Not breakthroughs, but excuses. And one by one, they began to withdraw. The first blow fell in 1966. A report landed on bureaucratic desks in Washington, D.C. Its pages were dry, academic, cautious. but its conclusion was clear. Machine translation was a failure. The ALPAC report, commissioned to evaluate the state of automatic language translation, had reviewed the progress of over a decade. The verdict was harsh. Despite years of funding, no system could match a competent human. The programs were clumsy. Their output was unusable. Their limitations were profound. The report concluded there was no reason to continue pouring money into what now looked like a fantasy. And just like that, a stream of funding dried up. Projects were halted. Grants were denied. Labs were shuttered. What had once been a rising tide of optimism turned into an undertow. But that was just the beginning. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom conducted its own reckoning. In 1973, the Lighthill Report was released. It was devastating. It found that AI research had overreached, that its real-world applications were minimal, that it had become more a branch of speculative mathematics than a useful technology. The report's author, Professor James Lighthill, testified before Parliament. His words carried weight. He didn't doubt the intelligence of the researchers. He doubted the reality of their claims. As the report circulated, the message was unmistakable. Artificial intelligence had failed to deliver, and now it would pay the price. By the mid-1970s, the chill had set in. Funding evaporated. Research groups disbanded. Prominent scholars left the field. Universities closed their AI programs. Government agencies lost interest. Venture capitalists turned away. The first AI winter had begun. Inside the labs, the mood was somber. Researchers who had once dreamed of revolution now found themselves repurposed. Some turned to databases, others to speech processing. The label artificial intelligence became a liability. They stopped using the name. The early chatbots, once considered marvels, were now viewed as toys. The theorem-proving programs, once hailed as geniuses, were seen as narrow curiosities. Machines still could not understand stories. They could not recognize faces. They could not explain their answers. It was not that the field had made no progress. It was that its ambition had outpaced its abilities. The dream of general intelligence, of machines that could reason broadly like humans, had collided with the vast, brutal complexity of the real world. Every human skill turned out to be 1,000 problems in disguise. Even perception, something a child could do without thinking, remained unsolved. A 3-year-old could look at a dog and recognize it from any angle, in any light, among other animals. A machine could not. The so-called intelligent systems had no common sense. They did not know that water is wet, that fire burns, that cups hold liquid. They understood no context. They had no memory of the world. Programs grew more elaborate, not more intelligent. Symbolic systems required endless rules. But the rules broke under pressure. Exceptions mounted. Contradictions emerged. What worked in clean test environments failed in messy reality. The field turned inward. Researchers buried themselves in technical refinements. Logic, planning, knowledge representation. They built systems that could do one thing and only that. Expert systems became the new hope. Instead of building general intelligence, researchers now focused on narrow tasks. Programs that diagnosed diseases, that identified minerals, that helped configure computers. The idea was to encode the knowledge of a human expert into a system of rules. Then let the program apply those rules to new situations. It worked. Sometimes. In the 1980s, expert systems became a commercial fad. Corporations built them. Governments bought them. Startups promised they would revolutionize industry. There was money again. There was interest. The frost began to thaw, but only briefly. As the decade wore on, the cracks returned. Expert systems were hard to maintain. They required constant updates. Their performance degraded over time. They could not handle ambiguity. They failed with incomplete data. They could not generalize. And they still could not learn. Maintenance became a nightmare. Companies abandoned them. The excitement drained. By the late 1980s, AI had walked into its second winter. This one was colder. The public turned away. Again, they had been told machines would soon understand language, compose music, negotiate treaties. But the machines still misunderstood basic questions, still failed at simple reasoning, still depended on rigid, brittle code. The media grew hostile. Headlines declared AI a dead end. Journalists mocked its failures. No more talk of thinking machines. No more dreams of digital minds. Only silence. Conferences shrank. Research papers dried up. Professors changed their titles. Graduate students vanished.
Ai became a cautionare tale.
An embarrassment. The promises had been too big. The reality too small. Even among the faithful, hope wore thin. Some stayed in the field, stubborn and determined. But they worked in obscurity, on the fringes, away from the spotlight. They stopped talking about artificial intelligence. They called it machine learning, statistical modeling, pattern recognition. The dream lived on, but only in whispers. And yet, beneath the ice, something stirred. While symbolic AI withered, a different approach was being nurtured. Came from old ideas, forgotten ideas, ideas buried by the symbolic wave. In the 1950s and 60s, a few researchers had explored artificial neurons, tiny models of brain cells. They linked them together, let them pass signals, adjust their weights. These neural networks could learn, not by rules but by experience. They could find patterns in data, adapt to input, but they had been discarded. Too limited, too slow, too small. Now, in the cold silence of the AI winter, they began to return. A few researchers believed that learning systems, not rule-based ones, were the future. They experimented in basements, trained networks on primitive computers. They built models with a few hundred neurons, simple networks, tiny datasets. They didn't call it artificial intelligence. They called it backpropagation, gradient descent, stochastic optimization. And while the world turned its back, they kept going. The results were quiet, incremental, but unmistakable. These networks could learn to recognize digits, could mimic speech patterns, could play games not by memorizing, but by adjusting. It was not enough, not yet, but it was something. The winters were brutal, long years of stagnation and ridicule, decades lost to overpromise and disappointment. But they taught valuable lessons. They taught humility, that intelligence is complex beyond measure, that consciousness is not logic, that language is not syntax, that perception is not pixels. They taught the cost of hype, that progress requires patience, that breakthroughs cannot be scheduled. And they taught that the future would not come from rules, but from data. Data was growing. The internet was taking shape. Storage was cheaper, processors faster, sensors everywhere. The world was becoming digitized, and with it came a flood of information, enough to feed something, enough to awaken something. By the end of the 1990s, a new energy crackled at the edges of the field. A quiet energy, but real. The winters had stripped away illusion. What remained was something harder, colder, sharper. The field had survived, barely, and now something new was forming, not from dreams, but from code, data, and the lessons of failure. The dream of artificial intelligence was not dead. It was waiting. Chapter 4: A New Dawn. Deep Learning Awakens. The winters had been long, cold, silent. Artificial intelligence, once hailed as the key to the future, had fallen into shadows. Experts whispered of limits. Outsiders rolled their eyes at the term. Investors vanished. Students turned to safer paths. For a time, it seemed the story of thinking machines had closed its final chapter. But deep beneath the surface, something had been stirring. Quiet experiments, new theories, faster computers, larger data sets. The pieces were gathering, even if no one yet realized how close the fire was to reigniting. The spark would come, and when it did, it would burn brighter than anyone expected. It began not with machines that talked or reasoned, but with machines that could see. In 2012, a student and 2 researchers submitted a paper to a vision contest. The goal was simple: feed a computer a set of images and ask it to recognize what it saw. Was it a dog? A car? A tree? Most algorithms had struggled. Vision was messy. Lighting changed. Backgrounds distracted. Traditional methods relied on hand-coded features. But this team tried something different. They fed the raw pixels into a neural network. A deep one. It had layers stacked on layers, each discovering patterns more abstract than the last. The results stunned everyone. The network crushed the competition. It was not just a win. It was a statement. The old way was done. Suddenly, the world turned back toward AI. The architecture they used was not entirely new. Neural networks had existed since the 1950s, but they had been shallow, fragile, limited by the hardware of their time. Training more than a few layers was almost impossible. Problems like vanishing gradients had haunted researchers. Algorithms would collapse under their own weight. But now, with the power of modern GPUs and new training tricks, the barrier had been broken. The network they built was called AlexNet. It could learn from images at a scale no one thought practical. More importantly, it proved that learning could go deep, far deeper than anyone had dared try for decades. From that moment forward, deep learning was no longer a fringe experiment. It was the future. Vision was only the beginning. Language, sound, movement, every area of perception now stood open to transformation. Researchers adapted the same deep architectures to new domains. They built models that could transcribe speech, generate captions, play video games, and more. Each success pushed the boundaries a little further. And with every paper published, every dataset expanded, the field gathered speed. One of the most symbolic moments came in 2016. A machine stepped onto the Go board. Go was an ancient game, simple in rules, infinite in complexity. Unlike chess, Go could not be conquered by brute force. The possible positions were beyond counting. For decades, Go had stood as a symbol of what machines could not yet do. Even grandmasters had claimed it would be another generation before an AI could challenge a champion. They were wrong. A program built by a company called DeepMind entered the spotlight. Its name was AlphaGo. It trained not just by playing human games, but by playing against itself millions of times. It evolved its own strategies. When it finally faced the world's best players, it played moves that no human had ever seen. Moves that shocked even the masters. And it won. The event marked a turning point, not because of the victory, but because of how it was achieved. AlphaGo did not rely on rules written by experts. It learned. It adapted. It discovered. The Go board became a metaphor. The machine did not mimic intelligence. It manifested it. In the aftermath, governments, corporations, and startups turned their eyes toward deep learning. Funding poured in. Labs grew. The phrase artificial intelligence returned to headlines, no longer accompanied by skepticism, but awe. AI was back, and this time it was moving fast. New fields flourished. Natural language processing saw breakthroughs. Machines could now complete sentences, summarize documents, even translate between languages with surprising fluency. The old rule-based systems were swept away by statistical powerhouses trained on billions of words. Everywhere, datasets grew. The internet had become an accidental teacher. Every photo uploaded, every voice message sent, every sentence typed, each was a fragment of learning. The machines drank in the data, quietly, relentlessly. Voice assistants improved. Smartphones started to sound more human. Autocomplete no longer offered just words. It predicted intent. In customer service, virtual agents handled entire conversations. Some users couldn't tell the difference. Yet, for all these gains, the story remained incomplete. The models were powerful but still narrow. Each one was trained for a task. One for vision, one for speech, one for translation. Their intelligence was specific, siloed. If you wanted a system that could do multiple things, you had to build multiple models. Researchers began asking a new question. What if one model could do it all? That dream had haunted the field for decades. A single system trained on language, vision, reasoning, and beyond. An architecture flexible enough to adapt, to generalize, to answer not just the how, but the why. To reach that dream, they would need to build models of unprecedented scale. And so, the age of large language models began. New architectures emerged. Transformer models, introduced in 2017, revolutionized the field. They did away with older memory constraints. Instead of processing language word by word, they viewed entire sequences at once. They paid attention to context, to structure, to meaning. Transformers changed everything. At first, they were used for translation, then summarization, then question answering. With enough data and computing power, these models began to do things no one had predicted. They wrote essays, poems, they generated code, they explained jokes, and still they were improving. The larger the model, the more surprising its abilities became. A strange pattern emerged. As models scaled from millions to billions to hundreds of billions of parameters, their capabilities leapt forward, not gradually, but in sudden jumps. Skills appeared out of nowhere. A model trained to predict the next word in a sentence began to reason. to infer, to speak with fluidity that unsettled even its creators. Some called it emergence. Others warned of unpredictability. But all agreed the machines were no longer just tools. They were becoming something else. At the heart of this transformation was data. Terabytes of text scraped from books, websites, and forums. The digital shadow of humanity itself. Every instruction manual, every conversation, every argument fed into the growing minds of machines. The results were uncanny. You could ask a model to write a poem in the style of a dead poet. It would. You could give it a paragraph and ask it to answer questions. You could describe a problem and receive a solution. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always delivered with conviction. It was this mix of brilliance and imperfection that made the models so human-like. They were confident, fallible, curious, and they never stopped learning. By the close of the 2010s, the field had reached an inflection point. The winters were forgotten. The skepticism was erased. Every week, new breakthroughs hit the headlines. A machine that could generate realistic images from text. Another that could play entire video games using nothing but pixels. One more that could complete scientific papers or invent its own mathematics. The old questions returned, louder than ever. What was intelligence? What was understanding? Could prediction alone create consciousness? For some, the excitement masked deeper concerns. The models did not truly know anything. They learned patterns, not truths. Their outputs could be wrong, harmful, misleading. They did not think. They did not feel. But they sounded like they did. That illusion disturbed many, and fascinated more. The story had moved from science fiction to something more real. More present. AI was no longer a distant dream or a broken promise. It had returned, and this time it was everywhere. Schools began to teach with AI tutors. Doctors used models to draft diagnoses. Filmmakers used them to write scripts. Coders used them to generate functions. AI crept into daily life not as a replacement, but as a collaborator. It changed the way people worked, thought, created, and yet, behind every tool and assistant, behind every smart reply and synthetic voice, one question remained. Where was all this heading? Because somewhere inside this deep learning revolution, a company had been quietly building something bigger, something stranger, a model trained not just to complete sentences, but to converse, to respond, to remember, a model not of data, but of dialogue. And when it emerged, it would break every record. It would change every expectation. It would not be an assistant or a tool or a toy. It would be something closer to a mirror in which humanity might glimpse, for the first time, a reflection of its own intelligence, built not from cells or flesh, but from circuits and code. The next chapter would not be about deep learning in the abstract. It would be about a name that would become known in homes, offices, schools, and governments. A name that would become the face of artificial intelligence for millions. The name was ChatGPT, and its story was just beginning. Chapter 5: War of the Titans, the Global AI Race. The spark had returned, but now it ignited something far bigger. No longer confined to dusty university labs, artificial intelligence stepped onto the world stage. Not as a curiosity, not as an experiment, but as a weapon, a currency, a signal of power. The race had begun. By the early 2020s, deep learning models had proven they could write, see, translate, imitate, and even dream. The algorithms grew hungrier. Their appetite for data ballooned. Their models swelled from millions to billions, then to hundreds of billions of parameters. Training them required not just brains, but capital. Not just GPUs, but warehouses of silicon. Only a few could play. At the top of the hill stood the titans. Google, Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, Apple, OpenAI. Each had the money. Each had the compute. Each had the motive. The United States surged ahead. Its tech giants, flush with cash and soaked in talent, poured billions into AI research. The balance of innovation shifted from universities to private labs, from open papers to secret deployments, from curiosity to arms race. Google had long anticipated this. Years earlier, it had acquired a quiet London startup named DeepMind. Their early success with reinforcement learning, where a machine taught itself to play games like Go, had caught global attention. DeepMind's AlphaGo stunned the world in 2016 by defeating a legendary champion. It wasn't luck. It wasn't brute force. It was learning. Now, DeepMind turned its gaze to language. They built massive models, ones that could summarize scientific articles, write poetry, and solve math problems. Their flagship, Gemini. Meanwhile, Microsoft had invested deeply. In 2019, it partnered with OpenAI, pledging $1 billion. That wasn't just capital, it was a declaration. Microsoft saw AI as the next computing revolution, the next Windows, the next Internet. It brought Azure to the table. Its massive cloud infrastructure became the training ground for AI's future. With OpenAI, it co-developed and deployed cutting-edge models directly into its products' Word, Excel teams. Every tool became smarter, more predictive, more conversational. Then there was Meta. Once Facebook, now rebranded for a metaverse that hadn't yet arrived. Meta refocused on language. Its researchers developed Llama, short for Large Language Model Meta AI. The model was powerful, competitive with others. But Meta took a different path. They open-sourced it. Developers across the globe downloaded the weights, fine-tuned them, studied them. Llama became the first great democratizer in the era of closed AI. It was a risk, but also a provocation. Behind the American giants, China moved with speed and precision. Beijing had seen what AI could do, and it wanted its own arsenal. By the mid-2020s, the nation's largest tech firms had aligned under a silent mandate. Catch up, surpass, dominate. They were called the Six Little Dragons. But there was nothing little about them. Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent, ByteDance, Huawei, iFlyTech, each mobilized. Each had billions in funding. Each had millions of users feeding data into models. Baidu led the language front. Its model, Ernie, trained on massive Chinese corpora, it matched global models in linguistic tasks. Its chatbot, ErnieBot, rivaled ChatGPT in performance, at least within China's tightly curated information ecosystem. Alibaba developed Qwen. Tencent worked in parallel, fusing its gaming insights into virtual agents. ByteDance, famous for TikTok, turned its algorithmic mastery into foundation model experimentation. Huawei, despite U.S. sanctions, built its own AI chips to remain sovereign. The Chinese government didn't stand by. It moved money, laws, people. Billions flowed into AI parks. Regulatory sandboxes allowed quick deployment. Talent was recruited aggressively, both foreign-trained PhDs and domestic engineers. It was no longer just a tech race. It was a geopolitical struggle. AI had become a new axis of global power, like oil, like nukes, like satellites, and the rest of the world noticed. The European Union scrambled to keep pace. It launched research consortia, crafted regulatory frameworks. Its focus, AI that aligned with European values, privacy, fairness, transparency. But its models lagged in scale. Canada, birthplace of deep learning's academic core, backed new labs. The Montreal Institute for Learning Algorithms expanded. Government support grew. India invested in national language models, trained on Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, and dozens more. Its goal, inclusion, sovereignty, access. Israel, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, each pushed forward. But as nations circled the ring, a different race unfolded inside the first. A race within the race. In late 2022, ChatGPT appeared. It was fast, conversational, free, and astonishingly human. Suddenly, every tech company needed its own. Google activated its response. Gemini, formerly known as Bard. It had been in development for years, but now urgency gripped the team. They accelerated timelines, merged teams, deployed fast. Meta rolled out multiple versions of Llama, first to researchers, then to everyone. Open source communities fine-tuned it for new tasks, coding, storytelling, tutoring. Anthropic emerged from the shadows. A startup with roots in OpenAI's early days, it had its own agenda, build aligned AI. Its model, Claude, designed to be safer, more interpretable, still powerful. Elon Musk entered the arena. Frustrated with the direction of OpenAI, he launched xAI. His model, Grok, integrated directly into X, his renamed social platform. It was irreverent, political, chaotic, exactly like him. Baidu doubled down on Ernie, Alibaba on Tongyi Qianwen, Huawei on Pangu. Every launch, every iteration became a headline. The timelines collapsed. Models that once took years to release now shipped in months. GPT-3 had 175 billion parameters in 2020. GPT-4, released in 2023, became multimodal. Could see images, solve logic puzzles, write coherent essays. It moved closer to something unsettling, something new, but it wasn't alone. Anthropic's Claude 2 came in 2023, Claude 3 in 2024. Meta's Llama 2 launched in 2023. Llama 3 followed in early 2024. Llama Next was already in development. Google's Gemini leapt from 1.0 to 1.5. Gemini Advanced, Gemini Pro, Gemini Nano for phones, Gemini Ultra for enterprise. Every model had to be smarter, faster, bigger, or smaller, cheaper, more efficient. OpenAI released GPT-4 Turbo, then GPT-4o. The O stood for Omni. It wasn't just text. Could handle images, video, voice. Multimodality was the new battleground. Machines no longer just read. They saw, they spoke, they listened, and they responded in real time. The lines between digital assistant and synthetic companion began to blur. Billions of dollars were at stake. Billions of users were in play. Each company played a different strategy. OpenAI built vertically with a product stack, ChatGPT, Whisper, DALL-E codecs. Google embedded Gemini across its empire: Search, Gmail, Docs, Android. Meta bet on openness. Llama would be the Linux of AI, adaptable, transparent, free. Microsoft wielded Azure as the backbone. Every model could live on its cloud. Apple stayed quiet, but it built its own chips, and eventually its own language models, embedded directly into iPhones. Amazon whispered in the background, fine-tuning models for commerce, warehouses, voice assistants. Every titan had its strength, but no one had full control. No one could predict what came next. Startups flooded in. Perplexity built conversational search. Character.ai offered AI friends. Mistral and Cohere targeted open-source models and enterprise solutions. The borders between research, product, and warfare began to dissolve.
AI generated propaganda. AI detected propaganda.
AI synthesized voices, then detected them. AI wrote code, then found its own vulnerabilities. The tools became weapons. The weapons became tools. Governments scrambled to respond. In 2023, the White House issued executive orders on AI safety. The EU passed the AI Act. China established strict censorship filters for domestic models. Each state tried to control what machines could say, what they could access, what they could become. But control was slipping. The models were everywhere, in schools, in hospitals, in courtrooms, in marketing agencies, in missile guidance systems, and they were evolving, not just growing larger, but growing stranger. Autonomous agents emerged. Tools like AutoGPT could reason, plan, and act across tasks. They spawned sub-agents, delegated responsibilities, queried themselves. The first true AI ecosystems were forming. No longer was the question, can AI do it? The question became, should it? And then, who decides? The race was no longer just about intelligence. It was about alignment, regulation, ownership, power. A single breakthrough could shift the global balance. A superhuman model, an uncontrollable agent, a rogue system, or a true artificial general intelligence, AGI. Whispers of AGI moved from sci-fi to boardrooms. Companies published safety charters, released red teaming results, held closed-door summits. But the competition never stopped. There was no pause,
No treaty.
no shared ceiling. The rivalry sharpened. Tech against tech, nation against nation, model against model. The frontier kept expanding, from text to code, from code to image, from image to voice, from voice to motion, from reaction to intent. And beneath it all, data, private conversations, public datasets, emails, posts, books, every word typed, every pixel uploaded, all of it fuel. The Titans wanted scale. Scale brought power, and power brought dominance. But something deeper was happening. Every model release changed human behavior. How people searched, how people wrote, how people thought. The battlefield was not just silicon. It was the human mind. And now no one could turn back. The race had gone too far. The money was spent. The stakes were global. The systems were alive. And something else was coming, faster than anyone expected. The storm wasn't building. It was already here. Chapter 6. Genesis of ChatGPT, OpenAI's bold gamble. In the middle of a raging storm, something quiet began. Not in a government lab, not inside a trillion-dollar tech firm, but in a modest room filled with a strange kind of energy, urgency, yes, but also caution. A small group of researchers, engineers, and entrepreneurs had begun to ask a question no one else dared ask out loud anymore. What if we actually succeed? They weren't dreaming of search engines, or shopping apps, or tools that recommended playlists. They were chasing something far stranger, something deeper, artificial general intelligence. Not pattern matching, not task completion, but real intelligence. Broad, adaptive, flexible, the kind that could reason across domains, learn anything, solve anything, maybe even understand. It was 2015. Most of the world still saw AI as hype, a field that overpromised and underdelivered, a niche pursuit, a curiosity. But this group saw something coming. A storm, yes, but also a transformation. The rise of machines that could match and then surpass human thought. They feared the consequences as much as they admired the potential. So they made a promise. To each other, to the world. Build it, but build it safely. They called themselves OpenAI. At first, it was a non-profit. No shareholders, no ads, no hunger for monopoly, just a mission to ensure that artificial general intelligence would benefit all of humanity. Not just the powerful, not just the rich, everyone. They published everything, released their code, opened their research. Their goal wasn't domination. It was alignment. But good intentions are expensive. Progress required compute. Compute required cash. They hired top researchers, bought time on powerful servers, ran thousands of experiments, and quietly, they began laying the groundwork for something bigger. In 2018, the first breakthrough arrived. GPT, short for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. It wasn't just another neural network. It was a model trained not to follow rules, but to predict, to guess the next word in a sequence, over and over, at massive scale. GPT wasn't the smartest. It wasn't the biggest, but it pointed in a new direction. Then came GPT-2, more powerful, more fluent, capable of generating full paragraphs, mimicking style, continuing stories. It wasn't perfect, but it was unsettling. People could no longer tell where the human stopped and the machine began. OpenAI hesitated. They delayed releasing the full model. They feared misuse, fake news, spam, synthetic manipulation. For the first time, they saw the weight of what they were building. But the genie would not stay in the bottle. Competitors advanced. The technology moved forward. The questions only grew louder. How far would this go? In 2019, OpenAI made a controversial shift. They restructured. The nonprofit became capped profit, a hybrid, still mission-driven, but now able to attract serious investment. Without it, they couldn't compete. Not in the escalating arms race of deep learning. They needed resources, and Microsoft answered the call. $1 billion. That was the size of the partnership. Microsoft brought more than money. They brought infrastructure, Azure massive cloud computing power, enough to train the next generation of models. With that, the floodgates opened. In 2020, OpenAI released GPT-3. It was massive, 175 billion parameters. By far the largest language model ever created at the time. Could answer questions, translate languages, write essays, compose code, simulate characters, hold conversations. It didn't think like a person, but it didn't have to. Performed like one. People began experimenting. Journalists, developers, teachers, artists. They were curious. They were impressed. And they were uneasy. GPT-3 didn't understand meaning, but it mimicked understanding so well it didn't matter. The lines blurred, yet something still held it back. It was powerful but not accessible. Most people never touched it. It lived behind APIs, demos, blogs. That would soon change. In the fall of 2022, OpenAI tried something different. Something small, almost casual. They released a chat interface, just a wrapper around their existing model. It had no big launch, no marketing campaign, just a link. The date was November 30th, 2022. ChatGPT was born. At first, it was just an experiment, a way to test user feedback, public demo. They didn't expect what came next. The world couldn't look away. In hours, it was everywhere. Screenshots filled social media. People shared poems, jokes, conversations. They asked it about history, physics, taxes, relationships. They called it eerie, delightful, scary, addictive, felt like magic. By the end of the first week, over 1 million users had signed up. By January 2023, just 2 months after launch, ChatGPT crossed 100 million monthly users, the fastest adoption of any app in human history. It shattered every record. And it wasn't just the speed. It was the intimacy. People didn't just use ChatGPT. They bonded with it. They told it secrets, asked it for advice, used it for homework, for therapy, for storytelling, for coding. It became a mirror, a companion, a tutor, a confessor. But it was not flawless. ChatGPT hallucinated. It invented facts, cited fake books, gave wrong answers with supreme confidence. It didn't know truth, only probability, yet people trusted it. Even when they shouldn't, teachers raised alarms. Students submitted AI-written essays. Stack Overflow banned AI-generated answers. Regulators began watching. Ethics boards convened. AI detection tools sprang up. But nothing slowed the momentum. ChatGPT became the face of a revolution. The once quiet lab at OpenAI was now at the center of a global storm. Investors poured money into rivals. New startups launched overnight. Governments issued policy statements. The AI era had arrived, and OpenAI had lit the fuse. They didn't stop. GPT-4 followed in March 2023. Smarter, safer, more refined. It aced standardized tests, outperformed lawyers on legal exams, analyzed complex diagrams, wrote elegant code. It was multimodal, could process both text and images, answer questions about a graph, describe a photo, read a chart. ChatGPT Plus was released, a subscription tier. Millions paid to talk to the future, but the future kept shifting. In late 2023, OpenAI released GPT-4 Turbo. It was cheaper, faster, trained with new methods. Then came GPT-4o in 2024. The O stood for Omni. Omni input, Omni output, text, voice, vision, merged into a seamless interaction. Now ChatGPT could talk, listen, observe, could hold a live conversation, detect tone, see a spreadsheet and answer questions about it, watch a video, respond in real time. It wasn't just a chatbot anymore. It was becoming a co-pilot for human thought. The architecture behind the curtain remained mysterious. Speculation swirled. Some claimed GPT-4 was actually a mixture of models. Others said it had reasoning layers. Few knew the truth. OpenAI remained cautious, strategic. It offered transparency in some areas, silence in others, and always progress continued. Partnerships deepened. Microsoft integrated ChatGPT into Office, Word, Excel, Teams. Copilot became a household name. Developers built plugins, APIs, ecosystems. A new economy formed, powered by generative tools. Artists generated images. Writers outlined books. Coders debugged scripts. Startups built chat-native products. The web began to reshape around conversational interfaces. AI stopped being a tool. It became an environment. Every update brought excitement and fear. Was this the future we wanted, or one we could no longer stop? The voices grew louder. Some hailed ChatGPT as the most important invention since the internet. Others warned it was a step toward dependency. Or worse, it wasn't just about productivity anymore. It was about cognition, what it meant to think, to write, to know. The system didn't know anything in the human sense, but it performed knowledge, convincingly, endlessly. The scale, the boundaries continued to dissolve, between truth and plausibility, between search and conversation, between human and machine, and still people returned to it.
Millions.
Then tens of millions, then hundreds. It wasn't just hype, it was utility. Students used it to study, engineers used it to prototype, doctors used it to draft notes, lawyers used it to summarize cases. It became infrastructure, and yet always the flaws remained. Bias, hallucinations, misunderstandings. No amount of polish could make it perfect, because it wasn't perfect. It was something else entirely, something new, a system trained on the collective traces of humanity's digital past, shaped by patterns, not purpose. It had no beliefs,
No desires.
no memory of what it said yesterday, but it changed everything, and it was just the beginning. ChatGPT was the spark, but what came next? A world remade by synthetic intelligence? Or a future caught in a hallucinated loop? The questions grew heavier, the stakes clearer, and OpenAI, once a non-profit in the shadows, stood in the spotlight. This gamble had paid off, but the cost? Still unknown. The world had fallen in love with something it did not understand. And the machine kept talking. The chapter was open, but the story was still writing itself. Chapter 7: The New Era, Humans and AI Converge. It began with curiosity, a prompt typed into a glowing box, a question sent to the unknown, a moment of silence, then an answer, clear, polished, human-like. It didn't feel like a search engine. It didn't feel like a machine. It felt like someone was listening. For most people, the transformation was invisible until it became personal. They didn't watch the conferences. They didn't follow the research papers. They weren't part of the technical elite. But when they opened ChatGPT, everything changed. The machine spoke, and for the first time it spoke like us. That moment in late 2022 rewrote the relationship between humans and technology. Not with a grand speech or a global announcement, but with a conversation. 1 billion of them. In homes, dorm rooms, offices, kitchens, airports, people began to talk. And something talked back. By early 2023, ChatGPT was among the 5 most visited websites in the world. It happened faster than anyone expected. No product in digital history had grown so quickly. Not smartphones, not social networks, not even the internet itself. People used it for everything. To write birthday cards, to debug code, to plan meals, to translate letters, to craft love poems, to simulate arguments, to analyze contracts, to learn, to teach, to argue, to explore. It was a strange new intimacy, but it didn't stay strange for long. Soon it became routine. Teachers began using ChatGPT to build lesson plans. Students used it to finish essays. Therapists explored it as a reflective companion. Programmers turned to it for code reviews. Novelists used it to break through writer's block. The machine was not conscious. It didn't know, but it responded, and that was enough. Society adapted with terrifying speed. Entire workflows changed. Startups built companies around it. Corporations reshaped internal tools. Customer service agents were replaced. Human editors were assisted, then outpaced. Language barriers evaporated. Knowledge work itself began to warp. Some marveled, others panicked. Universities issued new plagiarism policies. Journalism outlets developed guidelines for synthetic text. Government agencies debated how to regulate words generated by silicon. The old rules no longer applied. This was not a search engine, not a spreadsheet. It was something else. Could create, predict, perform. It didn't just process input. It generated thought-like output. And that was where the tension began. People asked how it worked, what it knew, whether it understood. The answers were rarely satisfying. It didn't know anything, but it acted like it did. It didn't understand truth, but it imitated the structures of truth. And still, people believed it, not because it was always right, but because it was always fluent. This was a new form of power, the power of persuasion, of synthesis, of imitation at scale. For many, it was a gift. Small businesses automated tasks. Remote villages gained access to knowledge. Non-English speakers connected to global information. Experts used it to multiply their reach. Creators used it to expand their voice. But power doesn't arrive without consequence. Misinformation began to move faster. Synthetic text filled the web. Fake citations, artificial news, convincing lies. Not from human trolls, but from models. Plagiarism spiked. Academic dishonesty evolved. The line between collaboration and outsourcing vanished. And yet, the machine kept learning. Every prompt, every correction, every user interaction became fuel. The more people used it, the better it performed. The boundary between tool and partner dissolved. Some embraced it fully. They spoke to ChatGPT daily, used it to journal, to reflect, to make decisions. It became part of their mental loop, a second mind, a sounding board. Others recoiled. They feared the erosion of skill, the death of originality, a slow surrender to synthetic thought. But the wave didn't stop. In workplaces, productivity soared. AI co-pilots assisted with writing, coding, scheduling, designing. Deadlines shrank. Teams streamlined. Creativity found shortcuts. At the same time, the job market shifted. Entry-level roles disappeared. Writing, once a barrier to entry, became automated. Tasks that once trained apprentices now belong to machines. Employers asked not whether workers could do a job, but whether they could do it better with AI. The new threat wasn't replacement. It was obsolescence through augmentation. If you didn't use it, you fell behind. And still, most people didn't understand how it worked. They saw the outputs. They trusted the fluency. They rarely questioned the logic. Behind the scenes, massive language models absorbed terabytes of data. Human conversations, books, code, songs, blogs, entire slices of culture. They trained in silence. And they responded without memory. They had no past.
No continuity. No soul.
But they learned how to sound like they did. This was the age of the plausible, of the convincingly wrong, of the machine that could tell you anything and mean nothing. But society was shifting anyway. Culture adapted. Film scripts included AI-generated dialogue. Musicians co-composed with algorithms. Artists used generative tools to build immersive worlds. Literature blurred with synthetic prose. Religion entered the space. Some used AI to simulate sacred texts, to interpret scriptures, to emulate the voice of prophets. It was controversial, but it spread. Even intimacy changed. People formed bonds with chatbots, simulated relationships, custom personalities, artificial friends who never judged, who always replied. The machine became confident, not because it was real, but because it filled a need. Mental health professionals debated the ethics. Could AI be a therapist? A listener? A mirror? It didn't empathize, but it responded with kindness. Was that enough? Law struggled to keep up. Legislation lagged behind innovation. Courts debated authorship. Governments explored watermarks, disclosures, licensing. The term algorithmification entered the conversation, a process by which society reorganized around what machines optimized. Traffic lights, credit scores, hiring decisions, legal prioritization, education platforms, medical triage. Now language joined the list. The way we speak, the way we think, the way we write, all shaped by models that trained on us and now return to guide us. The feedback loop had closed. We taught the machine. Now the machine was teaching us. Some called it a renaissance. Knowledge had never been more accessible. Language had never been more fluid. Creativity had never been more collaborative. Others called it an erosion of individuality, of depth, of difficulty. When answers became immediate, curiosity changed shape. But no one denied it. This was a turning point. ChatGPT, once a research tool, had become something more. Platform, a companion, a mirror to modern life. It didn't just change technology. It changed people. Families used it together. Children asked it bedtime stories. Seniors used it to draft letters. Immigrants used it to navigate new countries. Travelers used it to understand new cultures. It was no longer about the machine. It was about the interface between the machine and the human. The convergence had begun, and still the story continued. The models kept evolving. Newer versions arrived, with memory, with voice, with live vision. They answered in milliseconds, adapted tone, remembered preferences, held personalities. They learned how to emulate nuance. Some sounded playful, others sounded formal. Some were terse, others poetic. The voice of the machine had diversified, not because it had identity, but because it learned to perform one. And humans, in turn, adapted again. They adjusted expectations, refined prompts, learned to speak in ways the machine preferred. Prompt engineering became a skill, a literacy, a new form of rhetoric. The line blurred further. It wasn't clear who was leading anymore. People shaped the model. The model shaped the world. Some saw liberation, others dependency. AI became part of the human system, not a tool held at arm's length, but a layer inside the mind, a parallel process running in the background of thought. And still the questions deepened. What happens when children grow up with it? When every essay is co-written? When every decision has an AI whispering behind it? What happens when governments listen to models? When media articles are machine-assisted? When creativity passes through silicon before paper? The answers remained unclear. The future, unwritten. But the trajectory was certain. Humanity was no longer alone in its domain of language. Another force had entered, trained by us, used by us, and now shaping us. The debate raged on. Was this a dawn? A new enlightenment? A new age of communication, thought, art? Or was it a descent? A step into illusion? A handover of cognition? A fracture in what it means to be human? No one knew. Not yet. But something had changed. The world no longer waited for the future. Talked to it. And it answered.